The chair was empty again. I noticed it the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue, not with your eyes first, but with some quieter sense that something familiar had vanished from a place it was always supposed to be. The human delegation's chair sat at the far left of the Grand Conclave floor, at the end of the curved table where all 12 founding species had sat for 63 years. It was a plain chair. Humans had insisted on that. Every other species had brought its own ceremonial seat, cushioned, decorated, elevated according to rank and tradition. Humans had walked in on the first day of the conclave's formation with simple chairs, dark wood, no ornamentation, and the council had quietly laughed about it for years afterward. Now the chair was empty, and I was the only one in the room who seemed to feel anything about it. My name is Velkan. I was, at that point, a senior archivist attached to the council's record and memory division. I had spent 22 years keeping the minutes of every session, filing every resolution, cataloging every agreement signed and every grievance formally lodged. I knew the rhythms of this place, the way a clockmaker knows the sound of his own machines. I knew which delegates arrived early, and which ones lingered after sessions to whisper deals in the corridor. I knew which species filed objections as theater, and which ones meant every word. And I knew that the human delegation had not missed a single session in 63 years until 6 weeks ago. 3 sessions. That was what it had been when I first wrote a note to myself. A small note, tucked into the margin of the attendance record, because I had no formal category for it yet. I wrote, "Humans absent, 3rd consecutive session, no notice filed, check relay status." I checked the relay status. The relay was fine. The automated ping from the human communication array came in every morning at the same time it always had, a steady green signal that said, "We are here, systems nominal, all is well." The ping did not say anything about the delegates. It did not say anything about the chair. It just pinged, reliable and empty of meaning, the way a locked door looks exactly like an open one from far enough away. The council carried on. That was the part I keep returning to even now, years later, sitting at this same desk with the same lamp and the same archive screen. The council carried on. The session after the first missed attendance, the presiding chair, a species called the Vorath, whose delegate was a tall, gray-skinned figure named Counselor Dreth, called the roll, noted the absence, and moved forward. No inquiry was made. No message was sent. There was a small, private sense of ease in the room. I could feel it the way you feel a headache lift. The human delegation had been, for the past 2 years especially, an uncomfortable presence. They asked questions no one wanted answered. They filed objections to resolutions that had already been quietly agreed upon in the hallways before the session began. They had voted against the Resource Transit Restructuring Act, the only species to do so, and had made a formal statement so precise and so damning that 3 council members had refused to meet the human delegate's eyes for a full month afterward. The human delegate at that time was a woman named Lena Ward. I liked Lena Ward. She had a quality that I struggled to describe for years before I found the right word for it. She was steady. Not calm exactly. There was always something alert and alive behind her eyes, but steady. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage. She sat, she listened, she spoke when it was her turn, and she said exactly what she meant every single time. When the Resource Transit Restructuring Act passed 11-1, she did not storm out. She did not demand a recount. She nodded once, wrote something in her notebook and said, in a voice that carried across the entire chamber without effort, "The objection is noted and filed. The human delegation thanks the council for its time." I had been writing her words into the record as she said them. I remember my hand pausing. There was something in the way she said it that was different from how any protest had ever been lodged in that room before. Most formal objections carried anger underneath them, or frustration, or calculation. Hers carried none of those things. It carried something quieter and more permanent. I did not know what to call it then. I think now that it was finality. That was 8 months before the chair went empty. In the weeks between Lena Ward's last formal statement and the first missed session, small things changed that I cataloged but did not yet connect. The human delegation submitted their usual briefing documents, always thorough, always early, always impeccably formatted. Then the documents became shorter. Then they became templated, as if pulled from a standard form. Then, 2 weeks before the first absence, They stopped entirely. I sent an automated reminder through the standard channel. The response came back within minutes, perfectly polite. Thank you for your message. Briefing documents will be provided at the delegation's discretion. I filed it. I moved on. I should have stopped. I should have walked down the corridor to the human delegation's office and knocked on the door. I had done it before. Once. Years ago. When a filing error had misattributed a human proposal to the Vorath delegation, and Lena Ward's predecessor, a man named Colin Brace, had come out into the hallway already holding the corrected document, laughing. He had told me that humans had a saying, never attribute to malice what can be explained by paperwork. I had laughed too, because it was the kind of joke that carried the warmth of a species comfortable enough with itself to be self-deprecating. I did not knock on the door this time. I told myself it was not my place. Archivists observe, they do not intervene. I wrote my note, humans absent, third consecutive session, and I went home. The fourth session came and went. The fifth. By the sixth, one of the junior council members, a Vorath aide named Sketh, came to me with a question that was not really a question. He asked if I had heard anything from the human delegation. He had a particular quality to his stillness when he asked it. The way a person stands when they already know the answer will not be good. I told him I had heard nothing beyond the automated relay pings. He nodded. He went away. It was after that conversation that I began to look more carefully at my own records. I had 44 years of archives under my care. Every session transcribed, every vote recorded, every treaty, every amendment, every formal statement spoken on that floor. I had read all of it in pieces, in sections, as it was relevant to whatever I was working on at the time. I had never sat down and read the human delegation's contributions in one unbroken line, from the beginning to the end of what they had given to this council. I started that night, and I did not finish until 3 days later. The picture that assembled itself in front of me was not what I expected. I had thought of the humans as capable participants, reliable, often inconvenient. A species that showed up, did their share, and occasionally caused friction when their sense of fairness ran up against the council's sense of efficiency. That was the version of them I had held in my head without examining it very closely. What the archive showed me was something else. What the archive showed me was a species that had, over 6 decades, made themselves quietly essential to nearly everything this council did, without ever appearing to do so on purpose. Proposals that restructured medical resource sharing between 20 worlds, human-authored, the communication relay architecture that allowed species with incompatible signal formats to exchange data, human-designed, offered freely, as part of a cooperation agreement signed in the Council's 18th year, the translation matrix framework that allowed 12 species languages to exist in the same conversation simultaneously, adapted from a human linguistic model, so embedded in the system by now that I did not think anyone living remembered where it had come from. I sat back and I looked at what I had found, and I understood, with a slowness that embarrassed me, that the Council had spent 63 years benefiting from a species it had never genuinely respected. I understood something else too. The Resource Transit Restructuring Act, the one that had passed 11-1, the one that Lena Ward had noted and filed with that quiet finality, had removed the human colony's preferential access to 3 major transit corridors. Those corridors ran through space that had been mapped and made safe by human survey vessels. The act had taken something that the humans had built and declared it a shared resource, which in practice meant a resource that benefited everyone, except the ones who had built it, and the Council had passed it 11-1 and felt pleased about the efficiency of the outcome. I pulled out a fresh sheet and wrote a new note to myself. Not in the margin this time, on its own page. It read, "What have we done?" I sat with that question for a long time in the quiet of the archive room, with the overhead lights dimming toward their night cycle, and the automated relay pinging from the human array at the exact same time it always did, steady and reliable, and completely, terribly empty of the people it was supposed to represent. I did not know yet what I was going to find when someone finally sent me to look. I did not know about the station, or the document, or the particular silence of a place designed for thousands that had been left in perfect order for no one. I knew only this: the chair was empty, and the Council had not asked why, and somewhere in that failure of curiosity was the beginning of something that could not be undone. I closed the archive. I turned off the lamp. I went home through corridors that suddenly felt much larger than they had that morning, and I could not stop counting the human names in the index behind my eyes. Every proposal, every treaty clause, every small contribution that had accumulated into something we had never noticed, because we had never needed to look at it directly. They had been holding things up, quietly, for 63 years, and they had stopped. The morning I presented my preliminary audit findings to the Council's senior chamber was the morning the pharmaceutical system failed for the first time. I had been awake since before sunrise, going over my notes one final time. 3 days of continuous archive work had left me with a document I was not entirely sure how to describe. It was not a report in the traditional sense. Reports dealt with what had happened. This document dealt with what was happening right now, in real time, as a consequence of something the Council had done 8 months ago and not thought twice about since. I had titled it simply, A Review of Shared Infrastructure and Dependency Agreements, currently contingent on active human delegation participation. 14 pages. Single spacing. Every claim sourced directly from the archive. I carried it to the senior chamber at 8 in the morning and set it in front of Councillor Dreth, who read the first 2 pages while I stood waiting, and then set it down with the particular expression of a person who wants very much to believe the document is wrong. "This is an unusual report," he said. "Yes," I said. "You are suggesting that the absence of the human delegation has created, or will create, gaps in functional infrastructure." "I am not suggesting it," I said. "I am documenting it. The gaps either already exist, or are in the process of forming. The synthesis protocols on pages 4 through 7 are the most immediate concern." He looked at page 4. He read for a while. Then his aide appeared in the doorway and said, with the careful voice of someone delivering bad news to a powerful person, that there was a problem with the pharmaceutical synthesis request from the Velen Medical Authority. The standard processing system had returned an error. The formula authorization appeared to be locked behind a co-patent agreement that had lapsed. Councillor Dreth looked at me. I said nothing. I did not need to. The co-patent in question was on page 5 of my report, 3rd entry, flagged in plain text. Formula authorization for Velen immunosuppressant compound 17 currently requires renewal signature from active human delegation representative. Delegation participation lapsed. Authorization in limbo. Estimated impact. Supply disruption within 90 days to worlds relying on compound 17 as primary treatment. That was one entry. There were 63 more behind it. I spent the next 4 hours in the senior chamber, while a rotating series of aides brought increasingly worrying updates, each one corresponding to a line in my document that I had hoped would not be relevant yet. The stellar anomaly relay came up on its morning diagnostic and began auto-updating to a new protocol version. The update process required a security handshake from all contributing architecture partners. There were 4 contributing architecture partners. 3 of them responded immediately. The 4th, the Human Relay Network, sent back an automated message. "Handshake unavailable at this time. Please contact the delegation directly." The system paused, waiting. It was still waiting when I left that evening. It would still be waiting a week later, because there was no delegation to contact. Councillor Dreth called an emergency session of the senior representatives at noon. I was asked to attend, which had not happened before in my career. I sat at the side of the room with my report and my notes, and I watched 12 of the most powerful figures in galactic governance try to make sense of a problem they had never once prepared for, because they had never once imagined it was possible. The debate was not what I expected. I had anticipated defensiveness, the kind of institutional response that turns a crisis into an argument about who noticed it first. There was some of that. One of the Vorath senior members, a delegate named Orth, suggested early on that the human withdrawal might be a negotiating strategy, a pressure tactic designed to force concessions on the Resource Transit Act. He said this with the confidence of a person who has spent a long career misidentifying grief as leverage. Several heads nodded around the table. I did not say anything. I had 14 pages of documentation, and I had been awake for most of 3 days, and I had developed, in that time, a very clear sense of what the human departure was, and what it was not. It was not a tactic. Tactics are reversible by design. What I had seen in the archive was not reversible. It was the result of a species that had simply, finally, decided to stop holding its breath. But I stayed quiet, because archivists observe. They do not intervene. That is the rule I had followed for 22 years, and I was beginning to understand that following it had made me complicit in the same comfortable blindness that had brought us all to this room. The session went on for 6 hours. By the end of it, 3 things had been decided. 1. A formal inquiry into the extent of human integrated infrastructure was to be launched. A larger version of the audit I had already completed, assigned to a team of 12 analysts. 2. A formal diplomatic message would be composed and sent to the human delegation through every available channel. 3. I was to take a courier ship to Calum Station, the nearest human waypoint to Council space, and make contact in person. That third decision was made quietly and somewhat reluctantly, as if the Council needed to do something physical and immediate, but did not quite know what physical and immediate should look like. I was chosen because I had the longest record of interaction with the human delegation, because I had known Lena Ward, because I had filed every word she had ever spoken into the record, and therefore, in the logic of this institution, I understood her. I did not correct this assumption. I packed a bag that same evening. I booked passage on a Council courier ship scheduled to depart at 6 the next morning, and I spent that night sitting at my archive desk, not reading, just sitting, turning over in my mind the particular quality of Lena Ward's voice when she had said, "The objection is noted and filed." I had been writing when she said it. I had not looked up from the page. I had recorded the words and moved on to the next item on the session agenda, the way I had moved on from 1,000 other statements, because that was what archivists did. They caught the words and they kept moving. I wondered now what I would have seen if I had looked up. I wondered if the expression on her face at that moment had been the same quiet finality that had been in her voice. And I wondered if looking up would have changed anything, if I had said something, if I had walked across the floor and asked the question I had been trained my whole career not to ask. I knew, sitting there, that the answer to all of those wonderings was, probably not. The Resource Transit Act had been the 12th major decision made against human interests in 14 years. Lena Ward had not been a woman operating on a single wound. She had been a woman who had been patient for a very long time and had simply reached the end of her patience, and my looking up or not looking up on one particular afternoon would not have changed the arithmetic of that. But I wished I had looked up anyway. That much I knew. I wished I had looked up. The courier ship was cold, the way all Council vessels were cold, climate-controlled to a temperature that split the difference between the comfort ranges of 12 different species, and therefore perfectly satisfied none of them. I sat in the small passenger compartment with my bag and my report and a cup of something warm that the ship's system had generated when I asked it to approximate tea. The approximation was not very good. I drank it anyway. We traveled for 16 hours. I slept for 3 of them and spent the rest looking at the archive entries I had pulled onto my reading tablet. Not the infrastructure audit this time, but the older records, the ones from the early years of the Council, the founding sessions, the first agreements, the proceedings from the year the translation matrix had been introduced, when a human linguist named Arthur Cole had stood at the podium and explained, with extraordinary patience and a kind of unreserved generosity that I found difficult to read now without feeling the loss of it, how the framework worked, and why he hoped it would help everyone speak more clearly to one another. Arthur Cole had been dead for 30 years. His framework was still running. Every word spoken in that council chamber, in every session since, had passed through a system he had built and given away freely, and I do not think his name had been spoken in that chamber in 20 years. I thought about that for a long time as the ship moved through space that had been charted and declared safe by human survey teams whose names I also did not know off the top of my head, in corridors whose safety relay architecture had been designed by human engineers, whose work I had used every day without thinking about it. There is a particular kind of shame that comes not from doing something wrong, but from realizing how long you benefited from something, without seeing it clearly. It is quieter than other shames. It settles in behind the breastbone, and does not make noise. I had that shame for the entire 16-hour journey, and it was still with me when the ship slowed, and the pilot's voice came over the intercom, and said we were approaching Calum Station. I looked out the port window. The station was lit. Running lights along the docking ring, interior lights visible through the viewport panels, All systems clearly operational. From the outside it looked exactly as it always had, a busy waypoint, a place where ships paused and people moved, and the noise of 10,000 small transactions filled the air. We docked. The airlock cycled. I walked through. The corridor beyond the airlock was spotless, temperature perfectly regulated, air fresh and recycled correctly, with that particular clean quality that well-maintained stations had. The overhead lights were on. The direction signs were lit. Every system was functional. And there was no one there. Not a single person. Not a maintenance worker, not a customs officer, not the kind of incidental human presence that populated every working station I had ever visited. Someone walking somewhere with something in their hands, someone talking to someone else, someone just existing in the background the way people always did in spaces built for living and working. Kalem Station had been built for 4,000 residents and several hundred daily transient visitors. It was running at full capacity in every mechanical sense. It was completely, perfectly, deliberately empty. I stood in the corridor for a long time without moving. Then I walked to the reception hub, because it was the logical place to go, and because I needed somewhere to direct myself before the silence became too large to stand in. The reception desk was clean. The screens above it were running their standard information displays, arrival schedules, berth assignments, service availability, and on the desk itself, in the center, held flat by a small smooth stone, was a document. It was printed on physical paper, human paper, cream-colored, slightly heavier than standard, printed in 12 languages, one per page, so that whoever found it could read it in their own tongue without effort. I found my language on the 4th page, and I stood at that desk and I read it. I will not reproduce it in full here. It is already in the official archive, entered into the record by my own hand when I returned, and anyone who wants to read it can find it there under the heading, Final Statement of the Human Delegation to the Galactic Council, submitted without date. What I will say is this. It was not a manifesto. It was not a threat. It was not the kind of document you write when you are trying to force someone's hand. It was a record. Meticulous, calm, comprehensive. Every grievance documented in the order it had occurred. Every dismissed vote. Every treaty clause rewritten without consultation. Every time a human proposal had been quietly stripped of its original intent before being passed under a different name. Every time a delegation member had been interrupted, redirected, or ignored in a session. It was all there. Years of it. Decades of it. Written without anger. The way a careful person writes a report about something they have studied for a long time and have finally decided to put down. The last paragraph was very short. It said, "We are not asking you to make this right. We understand that it cannot be made right. We are simply making sure that when you look back, you will not be able to say that you did not know." I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I sat down on the floor of the reception hub because my legs had decided they were done. And I sat there for a while with the document in my hands and the silence of 4,000 empty rooms around me and the overhead lights running because someone had made sure everything still worked before they left. That was the thing that undid me more than anything else. Not the emptiness, not the document, the fact that they had left everything working, the climate systems, the lighting, the docking systems, the air recyclers, the direction signs. They had not taken anything down. They had not left a mess. They had simply left. And they had left the place in good order, because that was the kind of people they were. And the council had spent 63 years treating that quality as something it was entitled to, rather than something it was privileged to be near. I contacted the ship and told the pilot I would need to stay the night. Then I found the station's small staff kitchen, which was stocked and clean, and I made myself something to eat from what was there. Humans had labeled everything clearly, with preparation instructions in multiple languages. I followed the instructions for a simple grain dish, and I sat at a small table in the empty kitchen, and I ate in a silence so complete that I could hear the ventilation system breathing. It occurred to me while I sat there that this was the first time in my life I had ever prepared my own food away from home. There had always been someone, a service, a canteen, a colleague. I had never needed to read instructions on a container before. I thought about what that meant for a long time. When I tried, before going to sleep on a cot in an empty crew quarters, to send a message to the human communication relay, not through the automated council channel but directly, the way one person reaches out to another. The reply came back within seconds. It was polite. It was warm in tone. It said, "Thank you for reaching out. We are no longer accepting council diplomatic correspondence. We wish you well." I read it twice. Then I set down the communicator and looked at the ceiling of the empty room, and understood, in a way I had not quite understood before, that there was a difference between a door that was closed and a door that had been sealed from the inside by someone who had finally, after a very long time, decided that closing it was an act of self-preservation rather than defeat. I slept poorly. In the morning I walked through every section of the station I could access. All of them, as it turned out. Because nothing had been locked. I was allowed to go anywhere. There was simply nothing to find in any of it except more evidence of the same careful, thorough departure. Maintained systems, clean surfaces, labeled supplies, handover notes addressed to the station's automated management system rather than to any particular person, because they had known that no particular person would be coming. I found, in the communications room, a small framed image that someone had forgotten or chosen to leave. It showed a group of people, humans, 11 of them, of various ages, standing in front of something that looked like an early model survey ship, laughing. The image was old. The clothes were the style of 40 years ago. On the back, in handwriting I could not read because it was in a personal script rather than standard print, someone had written something brief. I do not know what it said. I kept it anyway. I put it in my bag. Then I went back to the courier ship, and I went home, and I prepared to tell the council what I had found. I want to be precise about the word I am going to use for what happened in the senior chamber when I gave my report. I want to be precise because I spent years afterward hearing other people describe it differently. As a crisis session, as a turning point, as the moment the council finally understood the gravity of the situation. Those descriptions are not wrong, exactly, but they make it sound more dignified than it was. What happened in the senior chamber was that 12 of the most powerful governing figures in our known galaxy sat in a well-lit room and listened to me describe an empty station and a document on a reception desk, and then they spent 4 hours falling apart in slow motion. I had prepared my report carefully. I had organized my notes from Calum Station, added them to the existing infrastructure audit, and produced a complete document that traced the full shape of the situation from beginning to present. I presented it without editorializing. I used plain language. I read the relevant sections of the human document aloud into the record, as was required by my role, and I did not change my voice when I read them even though I wanted to. Counselor Dreth listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. That was unusual. He was a man who interrupted frequently. Not from rudeness, but from the habit of someone who had spent his career in a room where speaking first established authority. He did not speak first this time. He waited until I had finished, and then he said, "They left a document." "Yes," I said. "And the document does not include any request." "No." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That seems significant." "Yes," I said. "I believe it is." The debate that followed had several phases, and I will describe them honestly because they are part of the record, even though no one in that room would thank me for including them. The first phase was disbelief, not of my findings exactly, but of the interpretation. Several members suggested that the station being empty was a logistical matter, not a diplomatic statement. One member suggested that perhaps the humans had simply relocated their operations and failed to file the appropriate transfer notifications. Another suggested that the document might be a draft rather than a final statement, that it had been left by mistake, or by a junior staff member without full authority. These suggestions lasted approximately 30 minutes, and collapsed when I pointed out, gently, that the document had been printed, translated into 12 languages, weighted down with a stone, and positioned in the exact center of a reception desk, in a station that had been systematically prepared for long-term vacancy. The second phase was what I can only call the search for someone to be angry at. There was some discussion of human provocations, the frequency with which the delegation had challenged council decisions, the formal objections that had slowed certain resolutions, the awkward statement about the Resource Transit Act. I listened to this phase without speaking, because I knew it was necessary, the way a fever is necessary, and interrupting it would only make it last longer. Eventually, one of the senior members, A woman named Counselor Vey of the Shen delegation said in a quiet voice that she thought perhaps the question of who had provoked whom was somewhat beside the point given the current circumstances. The room got quieter, the second phase ended. The third phase was calculation, the rapid, unsentimental assessment of what the withdrawal actually cost the council in practical terms, now that the infrastructure audit was complete and the full scope was on the table. This phase was the hardest to sit through, not because of what was said, but because of what was not said. Numbers were discussed, system dependencies were itemized, timelines were proposed for developing replacements or workarounds. The human document was set to one side, and the conversation became very technical and very focused, and I watched the room do what powerful institutions always do. When confronted with a failure of values, they turned it into a logistics problem, because logistics problems have solutions, and value failures sometimes do not. But the logistics were bad enough on their own that the calculation phase kept stalling. Every proposed solution ran into the same wall. The systems we needed to replace or work around had been built with a level of sophistication that required either human cooperation to access or years of independent development to replicate. The medical synthesis protocols alone were estimated to take 4 to 7 years to fully reconstruct under independent licensing. The relay architecture was worse. The translation matrix framework, the one that Arthur Cole had built and given away, was woven into the Council's communication infrastructure at such a fundamental level that several of the technical aides in the room went very still when they read that section of the report, the way people go still when they realize the problem is bigger than the room they are standing in. It was during the calculation phase that the formal diplomatic message was drafted. This was decided almost by consensus, as if sending a message was the one thing everyone could agree to do, regardless of what they thought about the rest of it. I watched 12 people who rarely agreed on anything nod in unified approval at the decision to reach out, and I thought about what it meant that the one thing capable of uniting this council was the necessity of asking someone else for help. The message took 2 hours to compose. I was not involved in the drafting, but I was shown the final version before it was sent. It was, I will say, more honest than I expected. It acknowledged the Resource Transit Act directly. It acknowledged a pattern of decisions that had disadvantaged human interests. It used the word regret in a context that appeared to mean actual regret, rather than the diplomatic use of the word that typically means, "We regret you are unhappy about the thing we do not intend to change." It was not a great document, but for an institution that had spent 63 years never once asking itself whether it had treated one of its founding members fairly, it was a more genuine effort than I would have predicted. The message was sent through every available channel simultaneously. The automated relay pinged back immediately, as it always did, confirming receipt. Then the channel went quiet. We waited. 7 days later, a response arrived. It was 4 sentences long. It said, "Your message has been received and added to our records. We appreciate the tone of your communication. We do not have anything further to add at this time. We wish the Council well in its work." 4 sentences, after 7 days. Sent, I noticed, not from the diplomatic relay but from what appeared to be an automated correspondence management system. Councillor Dreth read the response 3 times, and then he asked me, in a voice that had lost some of its usual authority, whether I thought a follow-up message would be appropriate. I told him I did not know. He asked me what I thought the humans wanted. I told him I thought the humans had already communicated what they wanted very clearly in the document they had left on the station desk, and that what they wanted was not a better offer. It was an acknowledgement that the offer had been too late. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected him to say. He said, "We assumed they would always be there." He did not say it as an excuse. He said it the way a person says something when they have finally located the exact shape of their own mistake, and it is smaller and more ordinary than they imagined, which somehow makes it worse rather than better. I said, "Yes, we did." He nodded. He dismissed the session. People filed out. I stayed behind because I needed to write the minutes, as I had done after every session for 22 years. I sat at my side table and I opened the record and I typed the date and the attendees and the summary of proceedings, the way I always did, careful and complete. When I reached the section where I was supposed to record the outcome of the meeting, I stopped for a moment. The formal outcome was easy enough. The message had been sent, The response had been received. A follow-up was under consideration. Further technical assessments were underway. All of that was true, and I wrote it down. But I also wrote, in the record, the thing Counselor Dreth had said. I wrote it in full. We assumed they would always be there. I wrote it because it was true, and because true things belong in the record, and because I had spent 22 years writing down what was said in that room, and I was not going to stop now, just because what was being said had become harder to hear. Then I closed the record and I sat for a while. There was a junior scholar who had been brought in briefly during the session, a young woman named Claire Odom, who had spent 7 years studying human cultural history and had been pulled from her department at short notice to answer a specific question. The question Counselor Dreth had asked her, with the particular desperation of a person grasping for an explanation that made sense, was this: did they plan this? Claire Odom had stood very still for a moment when he asked her. Then she said, with the careful honesty of someone who has done real work and respects what the real work showed her, no, they did not plan this. Planning would have required them to believe at some point that leaving was an option they were willing to take. For a very long time, they believed in this institution more than it believed in them. They stayed because they thought it mattered. They left when they finally accepted that you thought it didn't. No one in the room said anything after that for a long time. I thought about Claire Odom's answer on my way home that evening. I thought about the word she had used. Accepted. Not decided. Not chose. Accepted. As if the leaving had not been an act of will but an act of absorption, the slow, reluctant taking in of a truth that had been offered to them over and over until there was no more room to decline it. I thought about Lena Ward writing in her notebook after the vote. I thought about what she might have written. I thought about the stone on the desk at Calum Station, holding the document flat, and whether someone had brought that stone with them for that purpose, or had found it at the station. And for some reason that small detail troubled me more than almost anything else. The idea that someone had thought to bring a stone, or had thought to find one, in order to make sure the paper did not shift. That kind of care, that kind of quiet, thorough attention to the last detail of the last task, even at the moment of ending. That was who they were. And we had looked at it every day for 63 years and called it reliability rather than grace. I write this now in the 15th year since the chair went empty. The council meets. We have rebuilt and rerouted and renegotiated. The pharmaceutical protocols have been reconstructed under new independent licensing. It took 6 years and cost a significant number of affected patients access to treatment in the interim, and that cost is in the record because I put it there. The relay architecture has been partially replaced and partially bypassed through a set of workarounds that function adequately in most conditions and create problems in extreme ones. The translation matrix framework is still running on Arthur Cole's original model because nothing anyone has built since comes close to working as well, and every attempt to replace it generates errors in edge cases that require manual correction, and the manual correction team is now one of the largest departments in the Council's administrative division. We are surviving. That is the honest word for it. We are not thriving. We are surviving. And the gap between those two things is shaped exactly like the space a human delegation used to occupy. There are people on the council now who did not serve during the years when the human delegation was present. Young delegates, junior staff, analysts born after the leaving. They know the history as history. They read the documents, including the one from the station desk, which is in the archive and freely accessible. Some of them find it difficult to understand why the split happened. They want it to have been more dramatic, I think. A confrontation, a final argument, a moment they could point to and say there, that was where it broke. They are unsatisfied by the truth, which is that it broke quietly, over years, through the accumulation of small dismissals that each seemed minor at the time, and together amounted to a message that could not be taken back. I have been asked, many times, whether I think the humans will eventually return. I understand why people ask it. It is a comforting question to ask, because it implies that the situation is still in motion, that the door is simply closed rather than sealed, that time is a factor that works in the Council's favor. I do not think the humans will return. I want to be honest about that. In this final archival entry, which I am writing partly because it is my job, and partly because I am old now, and I think some things should be said plainly before the person who understands them fully is no longer here to say them. I do not think they will return because of something I have come to understand about grief. Anger wants resolution. Anger is a fire that needs something to burn and, once it has burned, can be renegotiated. Grief is different. Grief is what happens after hope is gone. Not hope that things will be fixed, but the deeper hope that they were ever as good as you wanted them to be. When that hope goes, there is nothing to negotiate with. There is only the changed shape of the world and the slow learning of how to live in it. The human document on the station desk had no anger in it. I have read it 40 times over 15 years. In quiet moments, in the way you return to something you are trying fully to understand. It had no anger. It had clarity and precision and a kind of bone-deep tiredness. And at the very end it had something I can only call the setting down of something that had been carried for too long. People set things down when they are done carrying them. They do not usually pick them back up. What I return to, most often, is not the document. It is a memory from early in my career, before Lena Ward, before the Resource Transit Act, before any of what came after. There was a human delegate at the time named Philip Darrow. He was an older man, patient and precise, with an ability to explain complex technical proposals in plain language that other species found extraordinary and that humans, I gathered, considered fairly ordinary. He and I had worked together on the translation of several large treaty documents, a slow and careful process that took months. One afternoon, near the end of the project, he had brought tea to the archive room without being asked. He had figured out, somehow, which variety I preferred. I had mentioned it once, weeks before, in passing. He set it on my desk and said, in the easy way of someone who considers small kindnesses unremarkable, "Long day. Thought this might help." I thanked him. We went back to work. I did not think about it again for 30 years. I think about it now. I think about it because it was such a small thing, and because small things, when you add enough of them together, become the actual substance of a relationship. Philip Darrow had remembered what I liked. He had brought it without calculation. He had not done it to build goodwill or leverage a future favor. He had done it because he was paying attention, and because paying attention to the people around you was, for him, simply how you moved through a shared space. That was who they were. That was who they had always been. And we had been so busy being grateful for the large things they gave us, the relay architecture, the medical protocols, the translation framework, that we had never quite noticed the 1,000 small attentions underneath, the cup of tea brought without being asked, the chair they had insisted on making plain so no one felt outranked, the way Lena Ward had said the objection is noted and filed without raising her voice because she had been raised in a culture that believed even losing should be done with dignity. We ruined something real. I know that. I have known it since I sat on the floor of the Calum Station reception hub with a document in my hands, but I have understood it more fully with every year that has passed since. We ruined something real, and we did it so gradually that we barely noticed, and by the time we noticed, it was already the kind of ruin that cannot be repaired. Not because the damage is too large, but because the people we damaged are too clear-eyed to pretend otherwise. This is my final archival entry in my capacity as senior archivist. I retire at the end of this month. The records will pass to my successor, a careful young man named Owen Pratt, who has spent 3 years as my assistant and who I believe will keep the archive honestly. I have one instruction for him, which I will give in person, and which I also put here in the record so that it cannot be lost. It is this: keep the human document accessible, not in the reference section, not in the historical files. Keep it on the front index, where it will be the first thing any new council member or staff researcher encounters when they open the archive. Keep it there not as a warning and not as a punishment, but as a record of what this institution chose, and what that choice cost, and what it looks like when a species that wanted nothing more than to contribute decides, with grace and with grief and with complete clarity, that it is time to stop. I am going to close this entry now. I have an appointment this afternoon that I have been putting off, which is to return the small framed image to the communications room at Calum Station, where I am told the station is still running, and still empty, and still maintained by its automated systems, the lights on and the air fresh and everything in good order, exactly as it was left. I do not know why I want to return it. Perhaps because it does not belong to me. Perhaps because whoever was in that photograph, laughing in front of that old survey ship, deserves to have their image back in the place where someone who loved them thought it should be. Perhaps just because it is the right thing to do, and doing the right thing, even when it changes nothing, still matters. I believe that. I learned it, late, from the people who practiced it best. I close the record.